April 16, 1945, 300 hours. Along the Silo Heights, 60 miles east of Berlin, the darkness erupts with apocalyptic fury. 10,000 Soviet artillery pieces, the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled, unleash a barrage of unimaginable intensity. The German positions, held by a desperate mixture of Wehrmacht veterans, Hitler Youth, and elderly Volkssturm, disintegrate under the onslaught. The earth itself seems to heave and tear. Behind the artillery curtain, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers of three massive fronts prepare to advance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front attacks from the east. Marshal Ivan Konov's First Ukrainian Front drives from the south. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front moves from the north. Their objective is singular and absolute: Berlin, the capture of Hitler's capital, the destruction of the Third Reich, the final victory of the Great Patriotic War. In Berlin, 2.5 million civilians huddle in cellars and subway stations as the distant thunder of Soviet guns grows louder each day. Adolf Hitler, trapped in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issues orders to armies that no longer exist. He moves phantom divisions across maps while above him, his once mighty capital prepares for its death throes. The Nazi regime that promised a 1,000-year Reich faces its end after just 12 years. The Battle of Berlin will last 16 days. It will cost over 1.3 million casualties, Soviet, German, civilian. It will see the Red Army fight street by street, building by building, room by room through a city defended by fanaticism and desperation. It will witness Hitler's suicide, the collapse of Nazi Germany, and the effective end of World War II in Europe. This is the story of the final battle, the apocalyptic conclusion to history's most destructive war. By April 1945, Nazi Germany's defeat was inevitable and imminent. Soviet forces, having driven German armies back from Stalingrad, Kursk, and across Eastern Europe, now stood on German soil. The Western Allies, American, British, Canadian, and French forces, had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly through Western and Southern Germany. The Third Reich was compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket, its armies shattered, its cities in ruins. Yet Germany fought on. Hitler, delusional and detached from reality, refused to contemplate surrender. From his bunker, he issued orders for counterattacks by armies that existed only on paper. He promised that secret weapons, jet aircraft, super tanks, perhaps even atomic weapons, would turn the tide. He declared that Germany would fight to the last man, that every city would become a fortress, that surrender was treason punishable by death. The Wehrmacht, though broken, retained dangerous capabilities. German soldiers, fighting on their own soil with their families behind them, often fought with desperate ferocity. The Hitler Youth, boys aged 12–16, had been indoctrinated with fanatical Nazi ideology and wielded Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The Volkssturm, a militia of men aged 16–60, not already in military service, manned defensive positions despite minimal training. SS units, ideologically committed to Nazism, fought to the death rather than surrender. Berlin's defenses reflected both German engineering skill and desperate improvisation. The city was ringed by three defensive belts. The outer ring lay 20–40 kilometers from the city center, utilizing rivers, canals, and the Silo Heights, a formidable ridge east of Berlin. The second ring followed Berlin's city limits. The inner ring, the Citadel, encompassed the government district in central Berlin. Each ring incorporated anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and minefields. Streets were barricaded, buildings were fortified. The city itself became a weapon. The Soviet plan was characteristically massive. 3 fronts, totaling 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, 7,500 aircraft, and 41,600 artillery pieces would converge on Berlin simultaneously. Zhukov's First Belarusian Front would attack directly from the east, the shortest route to Berlin, but also the most heavily defended. Konov's First Ukrainian Front would attack from the south, threatening to encircle Berlin from that direction. Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front would attack from the north, completing the encirclement. The strategy was simple: overwhelming force applied simultaneously from multiple directions. But Stalin had introduced a complication: a race. Zhukov and Konov were explicitly competing to be first into Berlin. Stalin deliberately drew the boundary between their fronts vaguely, allowing both marshals to interpret it as permitting them to advance on the capital. This competition would drive both commanders to take risks, accept casualties, and push their forces mercilessly. The Red Army would pay in blood for Stalin's manipulation. At 300 hours on April 16th, the Soviet artillery barrage commenced. For 30 minutes, the largest concentration of artillery in history pounded German positions. Then came an innovation: 143 searchlights suddenly illuminated, their beams creating artificial daylight and blinding German defenders. Behind the light curtain, Soviet infantry and tanks advanced. The attack on the Silo Heights became a nightmare of miscalculation and stubborn defense. Zhukov, eager to win the race to Berlin, committed his tank armies prematurely, crowding them into narrow approach routes where they became targets rather than breakthrough forces. German defenders, including the 56th Panzer Corps with the few remaining operational Tiger and Panther tanks, fought with unexpected effectiveness. The terrain, crisscrossed by rivers, marshes, and canals, channeled Soviet attacks into killing zones. The battle for the Silo Heights raged for 3 days. Soviet casualties were enormous, over 30,000 killed in just the first day. German defensive positions, though eventually overwhelmed, extracted a terrible price, but Soviet numerical superiority was crushing. For every German soldier, there were 10 Soviets. For every German tank, there were 20 Soviet tanks. The outcome was never in doubt, only the cost. By April 19th, Soviet forces had battered through the Silo Heights. German defenses collapsed. Survivors retreated toward Berlin in disorder. The road to the capital lay open. Zhukov's forces surged forward, racing to be first into the city. South of Berlin, Konov's First Ukrainian Front achieved a cleaner breakthrough. Attacking across the Nysa River, Soviet forces smashed through German defenses more quickly than Zhukov's front. Konov, seizing the opportunity, swung his tank armies northward toward Berlin, interpreting the boundary between fronts as allowing him to compete for the capital. The race was on. On April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet shells began falling on central Berlin. The bombardment announced the Red Army's arrival and shattered any remaining illusions about the war's outcome. In his bunker, Hitler received congratulations from his inner circle while above them, the city burned. Soviet forces converged on Berlin from multiple directions. Zhukov's armies approached from the east. Konov's forces drove from the south. Advanced units raced through Berlin's suburbs, crushing German resistance. By April 21st, Soviet forces had penetrated Berlin's outer defensive ring. By April 25th, Zhukov's and Konov's forces met west of Berlin, completing the encirclement. The German capital was surrounded. The entire garrison, approximately 300,000 German soldiers, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, and SS troops, was trapped. That same day, April 25th, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. The symbolic handshake between American and Soviet soldiers represented the physical bisection of Germany. Nazi Germany was cut in two. There would be no escape, no last-minute miracle, no negotiated peace. Only defeat remained. Inside Berlin, General Helmuth Weidling, commanding the city's defense, organized a desperate resistance. The city was divided into defensive sectors, each commanded by officers ordered to hold their ground to the death. Barricades blocked major streets. Anti-aircraft guns were depressed to fire horizontally at Soviet tanks. Every bridge, every crossroads, every building became a potential strongpoint. The civilian population, trapped in the city, endured unimaginable horror. Soviet artillery and rocket artillery, the feared Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, pounded residential areas indiscriminately. Buildings collapsed, burying families in rubble. Fires raged unchecked. Water and electricity failed. Food stocks dwindled. Thousands hid in subway tunnels and cellars, emerging only when necessary. The city that had once ruled an empire from the Atlantic to the Volga now huddled and burned. The battle for Berlin became a savage room-to-room, floor-by-floor, building-by-building struggle. Soviet tactics emphasized overwhelming firepower. Each building became a miniature fortress that had to be reduced. Soviet assault groups, typically 5,100 men supported by tanks, artillery, and engineers, advanced systematically, blasting through walls, clearing rooms with grenades and submachine guns, fighting upward floor by floor. German defenders fought with fanatical determination born of desperation. SS troops executed anyone attempting to surrender or retreat. Hitler Youth, indoctrinated with suicidal devotion to the Führer, ambushed Soviet tanks with Panzerfaust rockets. Snipers positioned in rubble picked off Soviet officers. Each building might take hours or days to capture. Each street was contested. The casualty rate was astronomical. The Red Army's revenge for years of Nazi atrocities manifested in horrific ways. Soviet soldiers, having witnessed the devastation of their homeland, arrived in Berlin consumed with rage. Looting was universal. Violence against German civilians was widespread. The mass rape of German women, from young girls to elderly women, became systematic and horrific. Soviet military authorities did little to stop it, viewing it as soldiers earned revenge. The brutality was a war crime of immense scale, a dark stain on the Soviet victory. Key objectives fell one by one. The Reichstag, the parliament building that symbolized German government, became a primary target. Surrounded by the remnants of several German divisions, the Reichstag's capture would signal the regime's end. Soviet forces fought toward it through pulverized city blocks, paying in blood for every meter. The Berlin Zoo became a surreal battlefield. German defenders used the zoo's structures for cover. Soviet tanks fired into the ruins. Artillery shattered enclosures. Animals, driven mad by the noise and destruction, fled into the burning city or died in their cages. The zoo became a microcosm of Berlin's apocalypse, civilization destroyed, chaos triumphant. The Landwehr Canal, running through central Berlin, became a critical defensive line. German forces demolished bridges, forcing Soviet troops to conduct opposed river crossings under fire. Each crossing became a killing ground. Soviet engineers built temporary bridges while under constant bombardment. Infantry crossed on rafts or swam, then fought to establish bridgeheads on the far bank. Throughout the battle, Hitler remained in his bunker, increasingly detached from reality. He issued orders for counterattacks by armies that no longer existed. He raged at generals who reported the truth. He shuffled phantom divisions on maps. On April 22, he finally admitted defeat was inevitable but refused to leave Berlin. "If the war is lost," he declared, "the nation will also perish." He would die in Berlin. Germany would die with him. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting within hundreds of meters of his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself while simultaneously biting a cyanide capsule, a redundant end for a man who trusted no one. His new wife, Eva Braun, took only poison. Their bodies were carried upstairs to the Reich Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline, and burned in a shell crater. The Führer of the Thousand-Year Reich ended as a partially charred corpse in a bomb crater, his dream of German supremacy dying with him. That same day, Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag. The building had been reduced to a shell by artillery, its interior a maze of rubble and defensive positions. German defenders, approximately 5,000 SS troops and Hitler Youth, fought floor by floor, room by room. Soviet soldiers fought upward through the building, clearing each level. Late in the afternoon of April 30th, Sergeants Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria reached the Reichstag's dome and raised the Soviet flag. the famous red banner symbolizing victory. The photograph, staged later for dramatic effect, became one of war's most iconic images. But fighting continued. German defenders in the Reichstag's basement held out until May 2nd. Throughout Berlin, scattered German units still resisted. General Weidling, realizing further resistance was murderous futility, defied Hitler's orders and attempted to negotiate surrender. Early on May 2nd, Weidling surrendered to Soviet forces. German units throughout Berlin received orders to cease fire. Not all obeyed immediately. Some SS units fought on, seeing surrender as betrayal. Some Hitler youth, too young to understand war's realities, continued attacking Soviet troops until killed. But by late on May 2, 1945, the Battle of Berlin was effectively over. The last shots fell silent. The Nazi capital had fallen. The Battle of Berlin's casualties reflect its apocalyptic nature. Soviet forces suffered approximately 81,000 killed and 280,000 wounded, 361,000 total casualties in just 16 days. These figures are conservative estimates. Actual casualties may have been higher. The Red Army paid a terrible price for Stalin's demand for rapid victory and the competition between Zhukov and Konov. German military casualties are harder to determine. Approximately 92,000 German soldiers were killed during the battle. Another 220,000 were wounded or captured, but tens of thousands more, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, foreign SS volunteers, died without being officially recorded. The total German military casualties likely exceeded 400,000. Civilian casualties were catastrophic. Estimates suggest 125,000 Berlin civilians died during the battle, from Soviet bombardment, from fighting in their neighborhoods, from disease and starvation, from suicide as Soviet forces approached. Thousands more died from causes indirectly related to the battle: malnutrition, exposure, lack of medical care. The mass rape of German women represents one of the war's most horrific crimes. Conservative estimates suggest at least 100,000 women in Berlin were raped by Soviet soldiers, though the true number may be double or triple that figure. Many women were raped multiple times by different soldiers. The psychological trauma affected generations. The crime was systematic, widespread, and largely unpunished. The physical destruction of Berlin was nearly total. 70% of the city's housing was damaged or destroyed. Iconic structures, the Reich Chancellery, the Brandenburg Gate damaged but standing, the Opera House, museums, churches, monuments were ruins. Infrastructure was devastated: no water, no electricity, no gas, no sewage system. Mountains of rubble choked the streets. The city that had once been Imperial Germany's crown jewel was a wasteland. Hitler's death created a power vacuum quickly filled by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whom Hitler had designated as his successor in his final testament. Dönitz, based in Flensburg in northern Germany, attempted to preserve some form of German government and negotiate terms with the Western Allies that excluded the Soviets. This fantasy lasted 8 days. On May 7, 1945, at Reims, France, German representatives signed an unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. Stalin, furious that the surrender hadn't occurred in Berlin with Soviet witnesses, demanded a second ceremony. On May 8, 1945, in Soviet-occupied Berlin, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the definitive unconditional surrender. World War II in Europe was officially over. But the Battle of Berlin's political consequences extended far beyond Hitler's death. The battle determined post-war European political geography. Soviet forces occupied Berlin and vast territories throughout Eastern Europe. The Western Allies, respecting agreements made at Yalta, halted their advances and allowed the Red Army to take Berlin. This decision, controversial even at the time, determined that Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet domination for the next 45 years. The division of Berlin itself, jointly occupied by Soviet, American, British and French forces, became a microcosm of Cold War division. The city that the Red Army had captured at such cost would be split, becoming a flashpoint in the emerging confrontation between former allies. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, would stand as the Cold War's most visible symbol, dividing the city the Soviets had conquered in 1945. Behind the casualty figures lie millions of individual tragedies. Soviet soldiers, after 4 years of brutal warfare, finally reached their enemy's capital. Many felt exhilaration at the victory. Others felt only exhaustion, having seen too much death and destruction. Some committed atrocities. Others showed humanity, helping German civilians, protecting women and children. The Red Army contained multitudes, heroes and criminals, victims and victimizers. German soldiers faced impossible choices. Some fought because they believed in Nazi ideology. Others fought because their families were behind them and Soviet revenge was terrible. Some fought because SS execution squads shot deserters. Many simply fought because surrendering seemed more dangerous than fighting. In the battle's final days, thousands of German soldiers attempted to break through Soviet lines to reach Western Allied forces, preferring American or British captivity to Soviet. Hitler Youth members, indoctrinated with fanatical devotion to Hitler, often fought with suicidal determination. Boys aged 12–16, given anti-tank weapons they barely understood, attacked Soviet tanks. Many died needlessly, sacrificed by adults who should have protected them. Their tragedy was exploitation, children used as soldiers, their deaths serving a lost cause. Berlin's civilians endured the war's final horrors. Women faced systematic sexual violence. Families huddled in cellars without food, water, or sanitation. Children witnessed atrocities that scarred them psychologically for life. The elderly, too weak to flee, died in their homes. Those who survived faced months of chaos, starvation, and uncertainty in the rubble of their destroyed city. The Battle of Berlin generates continuing historical debate. The first question concerns necessity. Was the battle necessary? By April 1945, Germany's defeat was certain. The Western Allies were advancing rapidly. Could the war have ended without Berlin's destruction? Some historians argue the battle was unnecessary militarily but essential politically. Stalin demanded Berlin as the Soviet Union's prize for bearing the war's heaviest burdens. The race between Zhukov and Konev raises questions about Stalin's leadership. The competition increased casualties as both marshals pushed their forces recklessly. Soviet casualties might have been lower with better coordination, but Stalin's manipulation reflected his characteristic distrust. He wanted no marshal to become too powerful, so he set them against each other even during war's final battle. The Western Allies' decision not to race for Berlin remains controversial. General Eisenhower's choice to halt Allied forces and allow the Red Army to take Berlin has been debated for decades. Churchill wanted to take Berlin first, fearing Soviet post-war dominance. Eisenhower argued that Berlin was in the agreed Soviet occupation zone and that Allied casualties would be unacceptably high. The decision determined post-war Europe's political landscape. The treatment of German civilians, particularly the mass rape of women, raises profound moral questions. The Red Army's crimes were systematic and extensive. Soviet authorities did little to prevent them, viewing them as soldiers' revenge for Nazi atrocities in the Soviet Union. This doesn't excuse the crimes, but it provides context. The cycle of atrocity, Nazi crimes in Russia followed by Soviet crimes in Germany, demonstrated war's brutalizing effects on all participants. The Battle of Berlin symbolically concluded World War II in Europe. The regime that had started the war, that had murdered millions in death camps, that had laid waste to entire nations, that had promised a 1,000-year Reich, ended in the rubble of its capital. Hitler's death in a bunker, his grand visions reduced to ashes, represented the ultimate bankruptcy of Nazi ideology. For the Soviet Union, Berlin's capture represented vindication after 4 years of unimaginable suffering. 27 million Soviet citizens had died, soldiers, civilians, men, women, children. Entire regions had been devastated, cities reduced to ruins. The capture of Berlin was revenge, validation, and proof of survival. The red flag over the Reichstag announced that the Soviet Union, written off as defeated in 1941, had endured and conquered its would-be destroyer. For Germany, Berlin's fall marked absolute defeat. The nation that had dominated Europe, that had conquered from the Atlantic to Moscow, that had seemed invincible, was destroyed. The country would be divided, occupied, its population traumatized. The recovery would take generations. The guilt for Nazi crimes would haunt the nation forever. For the world, Berlin's fall represented the end of history's most destructive war. 60 million people had died globally. Entire nations had been shattered. The Holocaust had murdered 6 million Jews. Civilization itself seemed to have failed. Berlin's ruins symbolized the catastrophic consequences of totalitarian ideology, aggressive militarism, and racial hatred. Berlin's reconstruction took decades. The city remained divided until 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunified. Soviet-style architecture dominated East Berlin, while West Berlin was rebuilt in Western style. Even today, traces of the battle remain: bullet holes in buildings, unexploded ordnance discovered during construction, memorials to the fallen. The Red Army's victory at Berlin cemented Soviet prestige, but also sowed seeds of the Cold War. The millions of soldiers who liberated Eastern Europe remained as occupiers. The Soviet-imposed communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany created an empire that lasted until 1991. Berlin's capture in 1945 determined European political geography for nearly half a century. Veterans of the Battle of Berlin carried their experiences throughout their lives. Soviet soldiers returned home as heroes but often struggled with psychological trauma. Many never spoke of what they'd done or witnessed. German veterans faced guilt, shame, and difficult questions about their role in Hitler's regime. Civilians bore physical and psychological scars, malnutrition, injury, trauma that affected future generations. The Battle of Berlin was the apocalyptic conclusion to history's most destructive war. 16 days of savage fighting, over 1.3 million casualties, a city destroyed, a regime ended, a war concluded. The battle demonstrated war's ultimate futility. Even in victory, the cost was staggering. The Red Army triumphed but paid in blood. Germany was defeated, its capital in ruins, its population traumatized. Hitler's thousand-year Reich lasted 12 years and ended in a bunker beneath a burning city. The grandiose visions of racial supremacy, Lebensraum, and German dominance ended as a corpse in a shell crater. The Battle of Berlin proved that regimes built on hatred, conquest, and genocide ultimately destroy themselves, but not before inflicting catastrophic suffering on millions. We remember the Battle of Berlin not as triumph, but as tragedy, a necessary but terrible conclusion to an unnecessary and terrible war. We honor the Soviet soldiers who fought and died to end Nazi tyranny. We mourn the German civilians who suffered and died in a war their leaders started. We acknowledge the crimes committed by all sides, and we carry forward the fundamental lesson that war, even when necessary to defeat evil, produces horrors that scar humanity for generations. The red flag flying over the Reichstag in May 1945 symbolized both victory and warning. Victory over fascism, warning about war's terrible cost. Berlin fell. The Reich ended. The war concluded. But the scars remain, reminding us that the price of such victories is measured not just in territory conquered or enemies defeated, but in millions of lives destroyed, millions of futures stolen, and decades of suffering inflicted on all who experienced history's darkest chapter. The Battle of Berlin was the end, but the lessons endure.